Good morning, everyone. My name is Lester Kiewit, and thank you so much for battling the rain and the weather. And I hope we'll have some warm and cozy conversation here this morning at the Open Book Festival. Again, my name is Lester Kiewit. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. Today we are talking about and having the conversation and the dialogue between myself and our panelists, and of course between you, our audience, and us here on stage. The conversation of heritage politics, the politics of memory, the politics of revivalism, the party politics of also who gets to represent who. We are between 8 to 11 months away from a next general election, and we're in that 5-year cycle where people are putting up their hands and saying, I'm going to represent those people because I identify with them and I feel that that particular group doesn't get the necessary representation, so I am going to make a stand or a play or a campaign to represent those particular people. We saw in our last local government elections in 2021, our outcome of that election showed a moving away of big church politics and political parties getting the support based on very narrow cultural language, even race classification type of voters. I think it's a very important conversation of how and what we see ourselves as a country, but also as a voting public come 2024. Joining me to have and unpack this conversation, and I'll start with my immediate left, it's Nadia. She's the author of Off Center and Out of Focus, Growing Up Colored in South Africa. We have Tessa Dooms, who along with Lindsay Ebony Chattel wrote the book Colored, How Classification Became Culture. And of course, Patric, Tariq, Mellet, the author of 3 books. There's one downstairs on the life of Reg September, but in discussion is his 2 books, The Lie of 1652, as well as Cleaner's Boy, a resistance road to a liberated life. There is a clear thread in the conversation that we are having today, and that is regarding what we consider colored identity, colored culture, fairly nebulous but also very direct and pointed at a group of people that, according to still laws that designate, make up between 8 and 10% of South Africa's population and a very large part of the population of Cape Town and the Western Cape. So my panelists, I really appreciate, and of course we'll have the time for conversation towards the end of the show, but simply because it is the book that I engaged with at the very latest, released just published 2 weeks ago, is Colored, How Classification Became Culture. Tessa Dooms, thank you so much. Let's talk about my opening salvo. Why is it that miraculously, a year before a local government elections and national elections, the conversation of who gets to represent so-called colored people comes up periodically from 1994 to 2024. What we've seen in the last 10 years is the growth of parties claiming to represent colored people. Why is it that every election we have this conversation, oh, the colored vote?
Yeah, I think it's because when it comes to the political organizing of colored communities, there hasn't, I think, at any point been a real clear reason to mobilize that has been sustained. So the mobilization is very much, what's happening in the moment, or it's very much a response to what's happening in the political system. But the organizing hasn't had a kind of sustainability to it, where people are organizing not just on the basis of, sharing this marker and this label of coloredness, but sharing a political mandate of what needs to happen. And so when you have a politics that is void of what must be done, it will continue to be this loop. The other part of it is, I think, the conversation about who colored people are. That conversation has ebbed and flowed as well. And so I think we've seen over the last 2 to 3 decades that different groupings at different times have, been at the forefront of saying, okay, we either don't want the label at all, let's reject, or we want to reclaim the label, or we want to talk about this in different terms. But again, those groupings have not had a unifying effect across, colored groupings. And so when people feel like that project hasn't gone anywhere, that their view hasn't won, then they retreat. And I don't think that is necessary. I think part of what we're trying to do in the book is remind everybody that there isn't a singular coloredness. And that when you try to organize around a singular coloredness, you're always going to fail because it's a fragmented identity. And by virtue of that, it's going to always be hard to go beyond or to organize just around the label colored if you don't recognize the complexity and just how different people are who come under that label or who are grappling with that label.
What is that label? Nadia, your subtitle is Growing Up Colored in South Africa, and what Tessa and Lindsay would say, and what my wife would say, is who grew up in the Northern Cape, the growing up colored is equally similar but also very different. So how would you say, what is growing up colored in South Africa?
So I wrote colored, throughout my 80,000 word thesis and the book with inverted commas, because it was a label that I reject as an apartheid construct. I think that, I'm glad to hear you say there isn't a singular colored experience. I mean, colored people who grew up in the Cape, even within the Cape, colored people in the northern suburbs, in the southern suburbs, colored people in KZN or in, they share certain characteristics, yes, but they also have very different experiences. And so I really grappled with it while I was writing, because I was interviewing people and different people from different places in the country, and at the same time that I was rejecting this label, there was also stories that resonated with me so strongly that they could have been my own stories. But I believe that these are stories of a group of human beings who were forced into a situation and who learned to survive. And yes, with all the different ethnic backgrounds that people came from, that there was this melting pot, and that it's not a, it's not a racial category, first of all, and that is what I reject very strongly. But also, we need to have this conversation, and it mustn't be a political conversation. I mean, it must happen here amongst us, so that we can flesh it out and learn what it actually means.
I'll read from the introduction of the Population Registration Act number 30 of 1950. A white person is one who in appearance is or who is generally accepted as a white person, but does not include a person who, although in appearance is obviously a white person, is generally accepted as a colored person. A native is a person who is in fact or is generally accepted as a member of any Aboriginal race or tribe in South Africa. A colored person is a person who is not white, who is not a native. That is absolutely balmy. That is mad. That is so Kafkaesque. Patric, that you have written quite extensively, particularly of where the first reference of the term colored comes into our picture in politics. It's the census of 1911, but your research and your work that you've done in Lie of 1652 and your other work, what does it tell us about this compartmentalization of a group of people who, according to the Population Registration Act of 1950, a colored person is a person who is not a white person, who is not a native?
Well, as you mentioned, the fuller definition is as clear as mud. Look, the whole issue of identity for us in South Africa has been framed by various forms of nationalisms. It is imposed identities. Even those identities, you can argue, for instance, that Zulu people, what is Zulu? I can unpack it, and I find there's at least 10 different groupings of people. There's diversity. It is a modern social political construct, and it applies to most of the groups that are in South Africa today. So what we need to do is to step one step aside and say, firstly, identity is not singular. As human beings, we are wired to collect identities and discard identities throughout our lifetime. And if you really just sit down and think about it, let's just take a simple thing. I have an identity as a man. You have an identity as a woman. But you may have a religious identity too. You may have a sexuality identity. Your work, I know for a big part of my life I was a printer working at machines. I was a printer and I thought like a printer. So we collect these identities and we discard them throughout our lives. So what we need to be able to do is to step, again, one step back and say, well, what is it that I appreciate about myself and those around me and understand about people? And when we go back in terms of this term colored identity, the term colored originally was the British colored people of South Africa. And in that identity, Xhosa people, Tembu, what they called Hottentot, what they called mixed other, all were part of colored. It simply meant non-European, non-white. Then we had a scenario when the Union of South Africa was being formed that they drew on the work of basically the person who was the father of race classification in South Africa, Wilhelm Bleek. And Wilhelm Bleek created this terminology of a Bantu, and so-called Bantu race. Bantu simply means people, like Kwe simply means people. So these academics created these terms, which then got politically sold to people. So in 1911, the first census that ever used the term colored per se was the first census after 1910. That was the 1911 one, where they said there was now 3 groups of people. So they herded, first of all, they took about 100 different African groups and sort of reduced them down to 10 so-called linguistic nations, and they called those people natives. Then they took about 42 different groups of Africans who did not speak any of the Bantu languages and called those people colored. That was the first marker, and then within that, they sort of ring-fenced people. So Chinese people were ring-fenced, Indian people were ring-fenced, Masbikas were ring-fenced, and so on. What happened in 1950 was simply a finessing of that system. This notion that apartheid comes in 1948 is it's a misnomer. It's got its roots. Every single act of apartheid has a predecessor act that was created between 1910 and 1948. So identity has been forced into a political mode. So what I've done is I've said, look here, what we need to do is, if somebody asks me, who are you? What are you? The first thing that comes to mind is, I'm a person that is born of a people that have risen above the greatest of adversities. That's my culture. That's my ancestral heritage. Now, if I want to know who those people were, then I start to dig. And I find that there's 195 roots of origin of people who were brought here as enslaved people, or indigenous people who were conquered by colonialism, or migrants of color who came here voluntarily. All of this is part of, there's non-conformist Europeans as well. Not every European was waving the colonial flag. There were many that risked life and limb to fight against that as well. So when we start to go into who these people are, the adversities that they faced, I begin to know who I am. Because I, in my lifetime, faced certain adversities, certain oppressions. I fought them. I rose above them. That's my identity. So what we've got to do is we've been like herded into a cul-de-sac around how we think of identity. Okay, so how then would we want to express that? And there's many ways that one can express that. as many ways as there are as many people we are. So I, for instance, refer to myself as a Camisa African. Camisa is not a race, it's not a color, it's not an ethnicity, it's not a language, it's not a religion. It's a river that flows through Cape Town. And that river has, in time, been covered over. The same as our history and heritage has been covered over. You don't see the Camisa River system, but it flows underground still into the sea. Millions of liters of fresh water every day, even when we had a drought. So, yeah, let me stop at that point. And
I want to talk about the impact of classification and a classification board that has impacted on families, on their politics, as well as the social and economic status. Tessa, you write about your father Elliot, whose name is not Elliot. He was born Lisole. And it was a story of a 16-year-old Lisole walking at an age where he was supposed to register, going in as Lisole, coming out as Elliot, and a family who have decided we are going to choose being termed colored because it gave certain political, social, and economic advances from its origins, or your origins, your family origins in the Northern Cape, to moving to El Dorado Park in Johannesburg.
Yeah, so I think the important thing for me, or starting point around that conversation, is that it's all very deeply political, right? All of this is about us making choices about how we are going to respond to power that's imposing on us and how we are going to claim our own agency in that process. So my father was born in the Northwest in a village called Ditakwaneng. I didn't know that village existed until about 1.5 years ago. And my father's now over 80 years old. I am almost 40. So in all of this time, being my father's child, I didn't know that. Because part of the creation of, this identity of my family was about concealing it. Because my father's experience of getting classified was being at school as a Motswana boy in a school with other Motswana children, going to be classified, without his family knowing, getting there and being asked the series of questions by the clerk that has to classify. And so he answers those questions, and amongst that, of course, is his name being Lisole. It's a Tswana name meaning soldier. My father then goes home with a classification of native, and the family then reveals to my father, oh, we didn't tell you. The adults didn't tell you that we are classifying as colored. And to do that, you have to present in a particular way at the registration office. And so now they have to find a way to take my father back to re-register using the name Elliot in order for him to classify as colored, so that he's classified in the same way as the rest of the family. Because the dangers of not classifying with the rest of the family would later bear itself out in terms of Group Areas Act and removals and that kind of thing. And so my father in that moment lost his name. He lost the name Lisole and didn't use the name Lisole. We grew up with my father's nickname being Solly in the family. We had no clue what Solly meant. It didn't make sense that your name was Elliot, but your nickname is Solly, and everybody's using Solly. But when I heard the story and asked my father about this and hear the story, I realized that everybody was complicit in this made-up identity. And we were all, as a family, complicit in that made-up identity. My mother is from an isiZulu family, partly as well. And when we were growing up, my parents made two choices. One was when my sisters were younger, they spoke Afrikaans, because they were now in the context of Aldos. And when I was born, my sisters were going to primary school, and they made the switch to English because they believed that not only being colored would be more advantageous, but speaking English as a colored person would even be more advantageous. So I then grew up in a context where my parents' home languages never gets taught to me as a political choice around what they were hoping to be able to raise their children to be able to do in the world. The impacts of that for how families come together, how they're able to be cohesive, is devastating. You aren't able to just have a family that is connected in the ways that you would hope they would be, because you have to live in different areas, you have to be in different places, you have to speak different languages, and you have to pretend you're not family in order to survive apartheid. And I think that I didn't understand the devastation of that entirely until I heard that story. And as Lindsay and I reflected on the first draft of the book, it is stories like that. We collected many stories throughout the book, but we realized that a lot of the making of coloredness has been a response to pain, has been a response to violence, has been a response to, to the breaking of culture. And so we've made culture on the basis of a lot of pain that we have not addressed.
Nadia, on loss, on spiritual loss, on material loss, we are in District 6, which is the still gaping wound and a living monument to loss. But when we talk about loss, there's also memory. And your book focused particularly on the photographic memory. Let's talk about memory and politics. If you drive into the CBD on Nelson Mandela Drive and you're looking onto your left-hand side as you're passing the scar of District 6, what do you feel in terms of loss?
Listening to my dad grew up in District 6, so it's quite a personal space and a personal memory for me as well. And my grandmother lived there, even though we lived in Warm Estate. I feel like I grew up in District 6 in many ways, because the doctor was in Hanover Street, my uncle was a tailor, the tailor shop was there. We had to go up and down District 6, so it's very much part of my memory. And of course, I was old enough to remember my grandmother being forcibly removed out of the flats and being moved to Mitchell's Plain. So, I mean, that in itself came with a lot of loss of community, a loss of, for my grandmother, independence, that suddenly she was no longer able to walk to the post office to get a pension, but she had to ask someone to bring her from Mitchell's Plain into town because there was no infrastructure in there. I feel like you asked me two questions, one about the photographs.
The loss and the memory of loss.
loss.
Your book is largely a thesis on the photographic memory on a people and how we tell and convey our stories through pictures as a form of memorialization.
Roughly half the book is photographs, and it was very much because that was what I had to go on. I didn't have a lot of history that I could go and research in the archives or even ask my parents about. And so that was the starting point for a conversation, and for conversations that I opened up with other people who I interviewed as well, was to start with something. And the photographs were very much sort of frozen slices of the way people lived. And in many cases, the way people chose to represent themselves in spite of being labeled colored and all the negative connotations that went with that. People took photographs as a way of showing who they were, of how they looked, of how they dressed, and you might say we colored, and you might say our hair is like this and whatever, but this is how we look now, and that was a way of, I feel, of recording that memory of, and it was a resistance as well. It was almost like, this is who we are, in spite of what you would like to call us. This is who we are.
If you are a friend of Patric on Facebook, you'd know that his Facebook updates are future chapters of future books. And I want to focus on the conversation on classification. In Cleaners Boy, you talk quite vividly about you walking into a registration office and you vehemently say, I'm not white, because I don't necessarily, I share a commonality of the people of Salt River and District 6. You came under a fair bit of flack forced into the army, interrogated, a gun in your mouth. But talk us through that particular, when we talk about families deciding, or even not even deciding, being forced into a particular box. How did you experience that?
Look, if we look at my family, my great-grandmother, my mother's granny, was a Damascus Xhosa woman who married an Englishman. You wouldn't maybe say that from looking at me, that just 2 generations ago we have Damascus Xhosa in our family. On my father's side too. So both my grandmothers were people who were registered as mixed other, which eventually became colored. And by the way, terminology's changed. The first terminology, which was a self-identification terminology of people who were of mixed, enslaved, and Khoi, called themselves Afrikaners. It was only about 200 years later that the Boers adopted this term African. Then there were people who were called free blacks, and then ultimately mixed other, non-European, colored, and I dare say it will carry on in this vein of terms do change. So look, one of my rude awakenings, there were more rude awakenings, that our family has always been, as far as I can go back in time, 400 years, people of multi-continental background, multi-ethnic background, multi-color background. We've always broke the rules. And it's even in the next generation. We have children in our family who are Nama, who are Griqua, who are colored, who are white, who are Indian, who are Chinese, who are Thai, in one family. And that's part of my identity. So I get to the age of 16. I had to go out to work when I was 15, 16. And as soon as you have to get a job, you have to have an ID number. And so you have to go and get an ID. And that's where I have this other rude awakening. And I fill in the form, not because I like the term, I put colored. And of course, the woman looks at me. She says, "You've made a mistake there. It's wrong." I said, "No, what are you telling me? Didn't make a mistake." "No, you should be putting there white." I said, "There's no way you're going to get me to put there white." I said, "My 2 grandmothers are colored. My 2 grandfathers are white. I live in a community which is not white. Why must I put white there?" And we have a huge ding-dong at what was, at that time, was called Internal Affairs, which is Home Affairs today. And she then writes other in the margin, and she says, "You need to go to see the Race Classification Board because that is now where this thing is going to be sorted out." So I said, "I'm not going to go there because my cousin went there already, and it was a whole bloody business." And eventually he told them they can stick their European up their arse. That was the way he talked. He was a seaman. I said, I know what this thing is about. So I get to leave, and as I'm leaving, she says, "Boetie, I know what is your problem. You just don't want to go to the army." I said, "You're damn right I don't want to go to your army, but that's not what this is all about." She said, we'll see, we will deal with it." And she called me, "You little communist, you'll see what we're going to do about this." And so they conscripted me, and they had to come and fetch me, and I refused to take arms. When they presented me with the right, I let it fall on the ground. I was arrested. I was arrested at least 6 times during that period. Then they tried to use peer pressure on me and basically drove me into the ground. I was coughing blood and whatnot. Woke up in a hospital bed. This was in Uppington. They then sent me from Uppington under a guard to Pretoria, where they played that I'd not done any of this, that they gave me a second chance. And the whole thing was repeated again. I was then arrested by the military police, taken to the security police at the Compal building, where all the people were falling out of windows and downstairs and so on, and then interrogated there. I spent 2 years refusing to take arms. As Lester says in my book, I talk about a gun having been put in my mouth, at my head, pulled up by my neck, told, I was never called by my name, I was called communist all the time, of Bondhotnot, that was another name they used. Then they would say to me, "Look here, there's only one way you're going to go home. You're going to go home in the newspapers as a story." So when I talk about identity issues and so on, it's not an academic exercise. It's not an intellectual exercise. It's something that's tears and pain and emotion all mixed up into one. And what I've learned over time is to be able, because I left school with a JC, what was called a JC in those days, Standard 8, from a trade school. So I had to teach myself. I had to learn through reading books. I had to learn to write through trying to write and so on. And now in my pension years, I'm writing and putting this down on paper in a coherent way to share with young people that maybe, are going through all the same turmoils. But there isn't a magic silver bullet that identity is this. It is a voyage of discovery for each one of us. And there is we mustn't be, my friend and mentor, Red September, refused to talk about so-called colored and to wave his fingers in the air. He said, I'm not a so-called. I'm a person. I have an identity. I've been classified as colored. I've been labeled colored. And I have to live with that, but I don't have to live with that forever. And so the title of that book is Red September, Liberated African. And in fact, that term liberated African also comes from slavery. There was a period after slavery was abolished on the high seas by the British that the Royal Navy would go and capture enslavers' ships and release what they called the prize Negroes of those ships. And many prize Negroes were brought to the Cape, but they didn't call themselves prize Negroes or prize slaves. They called themselves liberated Africans. And this is one of the reasons why I use the term Chamisa and African together, because it speaks of a particular kind of experience. In my family tree, besides the Khoi Xhosa, we have 26 people who were enslaved from various parts of India, Southeast Asia, and Africa. All of that is part of me. If I cut off any one part of it, I wouldn't be me.
Tessa, you're a black woman. You're also a colored woman. You're also an African in particular. Let's talk about that, because in South Africa, post-democracy, you have white, you have broadly black, and then you have black African in particular. How do you feel about how you identify as in terms of a government checklist that you're not African in particular?
Yeah, so last night we together went to Benjamin Jephthah's beautiful display of jazz, Born Colored, Not Born Free. And there's this moment in this video multimedia presentation where somebody walks, says, I am African in particular. And that moment just struck me, because one of the things that I've personally learned in the last 10 years of my life or so is to claim African identity very proudly. And then as I walked back another 10 years, I had to learn, and it was, in fact, a white mentor of mine, Paul Jamond, who first helped me accept that I was black. That only happened when I was about 20 years old. Because growing up colored meant growing up in a way that I had to reject blackness in order to be considered colored. And that was really jarring, given that I was growing up in a context where my mother's sister is a black woman, and my cousin's name is Zintle. But in order for me to be colored, I have to reject blackness. So pre that encounter with Paul and this questioning of why I'm having to reject blackness, my entire identity was about rejecting parts of myself and having to do that. And I think that one of the things that we try to explore in the book is why coloredness is not simply about biology. It is about a cultural experience. It's about a set of norms and values and experiences in a community. And that one of those experiences is the creation of color in a way that says you must reject blackness so that you have proximity to whiteness, because that's how you get value in this society. In in coming to an understanding about my own blackness, so I identify as politically black and culturally colored. And I do that in the same way that somebody who is Zulu can say they're black and Zulu, and nobody blinks. Nobody thinks, oh, that's weird. So I am black and colored because culturally, my experiences are within a community called a colored community that was making culture together and making life together. And so my hair and the way I speak and the way I think about things and language and music, all of that is culture. And it's a variety of cultures across the country that sometimes intersect in magical ways, like jazz music, which people in the Cape think they own, they don't. They really don't. But it intersects and bumps up against each other. But it is still that community, right? But I'm also politically black because my blackness is about understanding that white people created an other. And I am part of the other that whiteness created in order to segregate and in order to be superior. That's what blackness is. It's that creation. And so that shared oppression with people who have been othered makes me black. And it's not, blackness is also not something that I choose with pride. It's also an imposed identity in many ways. But it's one that I accept because it connects me to other people with whom I need to struggle for collective freedom and a better future. In the same way, my coloredness connects me to a group of people who have come together to try and find themselves amidst brokenness, rejection, marginalization, and being told who they want to be. And so I'm not going to reject that either. And when it comes to being African, so I spent a few months working at the African Union. And I started using the phrase then. My name is Tessa, I'm an African from South Africa. Because that also started to become important for me. That I have to understand that I am part of a broader continental story of what it means to be and how the rest of the world sees me. And so I say that to say that our identities need to become a lot more intentional. We must become a lot more intentional about the ways in which we're shaping identity. The way we write the book is what we call a reclamation arc. And so I start with my father's story in this registration office. But I end with my father's story going back to Ditakwaneng when he's almost 80 years old and telling us about his name and reclaiming his name and deciding that at 80 years old, he now has the right to determine how he's going to be seen by the world. And he's not going to be apologetic about it anymore. And so I'm not saying that every person who the state or society has called colored must embrace coloredness. I'm saying that all of us need to have the opportunity to accept the role that we have in shaping our identity and putting it out in the world, to have a new sense of agency about the way we put ourselves in the world, to not be told who we are and who we are not, and just accept it. Identity is messy, and it's messy on purpose. And we have to start living with that reality and stop trying to force each other to accept or reject, because there's a high level of subjectivity, even though there's a shared experience. And so what I'm hoping for, Lester, when it comes to
I want to
that,
talk in a short while about the
Okay.
colored, the Cape Town exceptionalism,
Okay.
but in a short while. But Nadia, you're a therapist, occupational therapist by profession, finding time to do the creative writing and the masters and the doctorate. But I want to talk about the healing of trauma and the trauma and violence perpetrated on colored people in losing their blackness, the proliferation of colorism, setting up other black people against each other. In Cape Town, we often have confrontations between people of Sekalo and Mitchell's Plain, simply separated by Jake's Careful. We don't necessarily have that. Maybe Tessa could correct me, but I don't see the reports of people of Rivoli or El Dorado Park necessarily in trench battles between people of Soweto. In terms of the violence perpetrated on all people in Cape Town, colored, black people in particular, what level is that violence? How deep is that trauma of seeing yourself as other to another person who is, in the Cape Town context, equally poor, equally working class, but we're fighting over the most basic of resources?
Yeah, it's very deep. Haven't been practicing as an occupational therapist for a very long time, and the creative writing really started because I was trying to make sense of my own history and where I come from, and it started this journey of the writing and then the PhD, and I had this naive idea that I was going to explore my history by looking at my grandmother. Was born in 1916, and I was going to look at this 100 years of women in the family, of my grandmother, and my mother born before apartheid, and then me, and then my daughter, who born in 93, so not quite a born free, but I had this idea that I was like this bridge between apartheid and that. And as I started on this journey, I realized that I had to go all the way back to slavery, that's how far back this went. And slavery, I mean, it fundamentally shaped our attitudes to race and sex in this country. And so that was a journey that was very difficult, of trying to understand and trying to trace roots and trying to also, I can't trace my family back as far back as that, and it comes with almost like a sense of inferiority, that I don't know exactly who I am and where I come from and that. But what is common is the fact that slavery fundamentally shaped, and it shaped the Cape. And even after slaves were emancipated, there were other ways of enslaving people through the DOP system and things like that. And so those divisions of race and gender and etc. go very deep here, and this is where it all started, really. So, and I don't believe we're all racists, as Sindiwe Magona said the other day, but I think we've all been racialized. That's how we see each other. And if I look at my own grandmother, and how proud she was that she was fair and had straight hair, and you know, we've learned to be racist. We're not all racist. We don't all associate negative aspects with people from the way they look. But so those attitudes were entrenched, and especially in the Cape, I think that it was because of the Coloured Preferential Labour Act, etc., all of those, it was actively enforced that you needed to be coloured to be better, to get a job, to etc. So, and we haven't had those conversations about that. We haven't aired that dirty linen.
I wear two badges. I don't know if you can see. I have a pin, one that says Kham. Bag that's over there, and it's labeled Sturvy. We often don't talk about the conversations around class and economic status. We know it's another conversation about the definitions of Kham and Sturvy, so we'll see that. But we often don't talk about class within colored communities, whether you're Afrikaans speaking or whether you're English speaking, whether you live on this side of the M5 highway or whether you live in the heart of the Cape Flats. Along with that, I want you to just tease out a little something for me, Tessa, about the Cape Town exceptionalism, because when we talk about the trope of colored people, it's Cape colored people. It's minstrels and it's gangsters. So I'm just using very shorthand here. But your experience of growing up in Johannesburg, to my wife's experience in the R, to Lindsay at the back, who grew up in KZN and then in El Dorado Park, all classified as colored people, but are differences as well. So tease out a little bit your thoughts on this Cape Town exceptionalism.
All right, and then I'm going to do some of the class stuff because I think it's important. So the Cape Town exceptionalism, I was completely unaware of as growing up. I've become aware in the last few years. The more I've come to Cape Town, the people in Cape Town don't think I'm colored. And or don't think I'm the right kind of colored, or there's something wrong with my coloredness, or something. And so it's been difficult because I don't know why I don't fit. And I've never understood it. But for me, especially in writing the book, but even before that, I've always seen the connections between colored communities across the country more than I've seen the differences, right? So I grew up eating the exact same food that's here. I grew up eating Gatsby's. I know that's weird for Cape Town colors to believe, but I really did. Rashid's in Aldo sold Gatsby's. I grew up every Sunday morning having a cook sister, and not the stroop cookie thing, the dough thing. And what we've forgotten about the South African history, especially the last 70 or so years, is how much migration has taken place. And that because of the Group Areas Act, if you were colored anywhere, whether you were other colored, Cape colored, if you moved to another part of the country, you became part of that colored community, right? So colored communities are these melting pots. And I think maybe people in Cape Town haven't had as much inward migration as the rest of us did. But I think we underestimate how much overlap there is between colored identities in the making of the things that we find common. An example that happened yesterday, a friend of mine who's from Darling, who was raised in Darling, was writing a status about his mother. I think I shared this with you last night. And his status, he says, Mommy always told me that Mommy knew what was best, but Mommy didn't tell me about this, and you may not understand what I'm saying, because in colored households, you don't say the word you or I or personal pronouns to refer to your parents. So you always, where I speak about my father and I speak to him, I say, Daddy, will Daddy please take Daddy's stuff to Daddy's room? Now, I thought that was a thing happening in my household. It was happening across the country from Limpopo to the Cape. That's culture. And we haven't given ourselves enough credit as colored people for how much we have interwoven our cultural experiences, how much we've traded, not only amongst ourselves. I mean, we've borrowed so much from the US, the African-American experiences, across the country when it comes to coloredness. So I think we've invented more of a melting pot than people in Cape Town give us credit for.
Just reflect on, is issues on identity and class as much as an issue as it is here
absolutely.
in Cape Town?
So what you call sturvy, we called highbuck. So if you were English speaking at school, you were part of a smaller group of people, and you were then seen as, and like I said, my parents made that choice intentionally because they believed it would give better opportunities. And so anything that gave you a more of a proximity to whiteness, and English was one of those things, made you seem of a different status class-wise, and then you get treated differently. And it's more actually not that you're treated differently, but people perceive you as treating them worse. Because the entire psyche of coloredness is that somebody's better and somebody's worse. That's what we were socialized to believe. And so if I have a proximity to whiteness, that must mean in the minds of people around me that I'm going to treat them poorly. And just to end this off, I'm not going to go into details of this, but when I had my first boyfriend who happened to be black, my colored friends, male friends, said to me, how dare you? Because how would you date somebody who is black, who is seen as worse than us? That means you're saying something about us. That's the level of the brokenness of our psyche in the way we see difference.
Before we go to a round of questions, I just want you to touch on something very important currently is simmering under, and that is the concept of indigene identity, revivalism, and it's speaking into particularly politics. We have a development on the banks of the Black and the Lisbik River that has been contested because of people's rival thoughts on ownership and heritage. But talk about how indigenous revivalism has spoken to the conversation around heritage politics, particularly in this context in Cape Town, Patric.
Sure, okay, but just one thing briefly. The whole issue of not saying you and she and him is actually rooted in slavery. In 1808, there was a major slave uprising of 426 people led by Louis of Mauritius and Abram van der Kap. Abram van der Kap was sentenced in court to death because he had made a speech saying, tomorrow after we take over the castle and raise the red flag, you will be able to call your masters J, you, and your madam say, she. For that he got the death sentence, because you were only allowed to talk about boss and madam, or you called them mother and father. The patriarchy and slavery is very much in together. But getting onto the subject you've asked me about, look, there's been this, in the last 30 years only, there has been this Khoi revivalism. And there's a lot of genuineness amongst it, but there's also a lot of opportunism amongst it. Why would you choose specifically the 17th century stereotypes of Khoi people to model yourself after? Why not the 14th century, the 8th century, in the 2nd century? Or why not post-1700, the Griqua who were organized, the Nama, etc. So there's a zooming in to Jan van Riebeeck's diaries, basically, and a few other colonial writers who basically lay out a whole range of stereotypes. And so you find people acting out the stereotypes. I mean, was there ever such a thing as a high commissioner of the Khoi? I mean, these are complete fraudulent things plucked out of the air. In the same way, this confluence that exists in Observatory, the Lisbik River as it now stands in the Black River are completely reconfigured. They don't even run in the same place they used to run. And there wasn't a confluence there. The Lisbik River actually ran right through Salt River into the Salt River estuary. The Black River ran separately into the Salt River estuary on the other side, where in those days there was something called Pardon Island, which was actually an island of land almost completely circled by water, a bit like Milnerton Lagoon. When we start to look at these things, you see a great degree of contrivedness. Now, I interact with organized Khoi revival groupings, and as I say, there's nothing wrong and you cannot condemn revivalism. But the nature of that revivalism, much of it has to be questioned because it's based on fraudulent histories on the lies of 1652. And by the way, we now have the lies of the 21st century too. So there has to be robust debate. Also, we know that almost every national group in South Africa, I don't like this word tribes and so on, it's also a colonial terminology. Almost every social group in South Africa has Khoi and San people at their root. When I talked about the Zulu, if you take the Zulu, Khoi, San, Bakoni, Klube, Tsonga, Twetwa, Ndwane, Ndebele, all of these parts were only welded together in the between 1810 and 1820 with the rise of Shaka, who himself came from the Rosvi Empire. His people came from the Rosvi Empire, the Embo. There's history before Europeans were here that goes back thousands of years. And we've constructed things, and revivalism has constructed things based on a 17th century European stereotype. And people are acting out this stereotype very often. And that's what I try to tell people, but not in a, one cannot be arrogant about things. People are searching, and they have the right to search, and they have the right to experiment, And to my mind, I must respect that too.
And that's the violence. We are searching for something that has either been taken or thrust upon us. I'm going to take a liberty of going 5 minutes over time because I have, and Mervyn could then find me. But it's now my opportunity to offer you a chance for a conversation. Yeah, and whoever is closest to the mic, I see that lady. I'll go to the gentleman with the shades at the back.
Hello, Lester. I'm Anne from Thornton.
Hello, Anne. Not from Thornton, from Protea Village.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Yes,
Anne from
yes.
Protea Village.
Yes. I listened to what the three speakers had said. I just want to say, when you apply for a job in the government departments, tell me what blocks do you tick on that form. I worked for government. There still stands colored, black, and black, by the way. In 1973, I was at UWC, and that term was used as a black consciousness term for all disenfranchised people. So I sometimes wonder who grabbed and used that term, black. So it refers to, is it one particular group or many groups? If I look at my own family, we a rainbow nation within our family. Dark to very fair, long hair, curly hair, krusare, wat mense van gepraat het. You know, I am a South African first of all. When I go overseas, what do I tell people? I go as a South African. I'm damn well a taxpayer here. And nobody's going to tell me I'm lower than them. I fought for the liberation of this country. And even if I'm classified colored, yes, a mixture. I loved what Patric talked about. We are a mixture of people, so rich in heritage, our culture. In my village where I lived, and many people don't even remember that a village existed there. They only know of the Kirstenbosch Botanical Gardens. Because no house, no family of color remained there. My mom was from Newlands Village. No family was remained there. So it's seen as an upper middle class, very rich. Friends of the Leesbeek River would love us not to return. We also have those experiences, restitution. People are so scared if that colored community goes back there, that mixed community goes back, their properties will devalue. But I just want to say to people, as we've been classified colored, we don't have to feel like in the dumps, God Almighty. I am, and I will always be. I am somebody. The white people here, I don't look down on you, but you're never better than me. Never were, never will be, and nobody else. We have to stand. I've got to say, I am somebody. I lived in Protea, I was born there. We went to the Anglican church there. We had certain things that we did. You're so right, Tessa, when you talk about culture. Because in every community, you have certain things, and it's true. If you came from somewhere else into a colored community, yes, you would probably have a different accent. I had a friend, there was an activist, Mrs. Vester Smith, who lived in Noordgesig in Joburg. She had a completely different accent to the area that I come from. And they did certain things different. What foods did we eat? Cabbage food, pens and porches. You know, we don't have to be embarrassed about that.
Absolutely.
We survived. Christmas time, the lay-by system. Yes, you talked about the cook sisters, but I want to talk about the lay-by system because it was poverty. You know, my mom lay-byed already January or December, even if the shoes were going to be too small when you get them. But that is how, also played a big role.
Yeah.
Our parents taught us to work. I once went to this white woman's house where my mother worked, and the damn pots were on the floor because they were waiting for her to come back on Monday. And I said to my mother, but they have a daughter. She's big, how come she's not cleaning? Because we were taught to clean and not wait for the servant to come and do that. I'm not, you know, life is different now, but I just want to say to people, no, I am, you must be proud of yourself.
Yeah.
And you contribute. My children went to sex. After 1992, there was a referendum. The white people had to give permission for me, for my child to go to sex. Yet I was a taxpayer, taught at UCT, but my children had to get permission to go to school there. And every day I drove past that place and saw how these lovely children, I said, but why can't my children go to that school? I have to take the separated bus where I had to sit at the back. The older people all know what I'm talking about. We had to sit at the back while that little naughty bugger, because he's white, ran to the front seat, or my mother had to go upstairs. No, this is the reality.
Yeah.
That is the reality. But you know what? That for me is the past. And I tell my children, I'm married to a Xhosa man. Sol would probably be angry at me saying that here, because we don't throw it around. That's our lives. I always tell my children, because yes, they do experience discrimination from not just one racial group. They always ask, why do you look different, but you have a strange name and your surname? So 2 weeks ago, I bought the Book of a
And
Gentleman.
I'm so sorry to silence you, but I appreciate.
Lester, thank you. I'll close off and just
Thank
say
you.
again, you know, I'm proud that I'm a South African.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And everybody should feel, I can't say enough of that. You never have to let your head hang because you're classified as colored. No.
And thank you so much. Really appreciate it. We're running out of time. I'm trying to get as many voices. The gentleman at the back with a beanie and the glasses. He's looking very, very dodgy, but I'm sure he's a nice man.
Thank you, Lester. So, just a backdrop. I spoke to a lady recently and we chatted about Langarm dance, the music. She didn't know what it was about and I was shocked. Not like Cyril, but I was shocked. So, Tessa, if you could speak about the education. What more can we do to educate our people? Because there's a disconnect, as you know. And Patric, do you perhaps have a curriculum for us to follow to not only educate colored people, but, well, all of us as South Africans? Thank you.
Okay, and then the gentleman there, then we'll wrap up, and then okay, sorry, then let's go there. If our producers or the organizers could just give us an indication what time is the next session here, and we can take our cue from that. But sir, in the back.
Thanks for the wonderful talk. I actually run a tour guide service called Cape Town Heritage Tours, so this is right up my alley. I always tell tourists that the best thing about being South African is it's like being American, where to be that label can mean anything, like race, identity-wise. So much goes into being South African that it's like a whole encyclopedia of people underneath that. I think what I was going to ask is just what you guys think about during apartheid, so much of racial politics was based around divide and rule, fundamentally treating everyone as if they're compartmentalizing that. And we've had freedom of expression and freedom of identity for 30 years, but it doesn't feel like we've grown united in diversity. It doesn't feel like that freedom of identity has allowed us to kind of create anything common or anything that's held. We feel more divided than ever. And do you feel like there's a way beyond that through identity?
Okay, we'll do the gentleman there just for this round, and then we'll take it back to our panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lester. I'm Demet Wissels. Ja, ik het altijd gedink, wanneer gaat ik die kans kry om my huistaal te praat voor almal? But okay, I'm not going to go there because then most of the people won't understand me. But one of the things that I thought of whilst I was sitting, and I just came from a session at the bottom where they spoke about the Khoisan language, and the guy introduced us to the language. And my daughter here, and I was thinking, whilst I was sitting there, I was thinking, you know, just imagine if this language was part of my life, then my daughter would have been able to speak the language of my forefathers. But then I listened to the panel, and thank you for sharing. And Tessa spoke about her dad and the 80 years of his life. And then I thought, how long are we still going to just engage and communicate? Because we all talk about we must engage, we must speak about this thing. But when are we going to start rectifying what was wrong? Because I cannot see that I'm still going to speak to my daughter for the next 30 years. And she's most probably going to speak to her children for another 50 years. But when are we going to start this thing of taking it by the horns and actually fixing what was wrong? Thanks.
Kankas. Thank you so much, Eva. I'll bring it back to our panel. Patric, if you could, 60 to 90 seconds. Tessa, 60 to 90 seconds. Nadia, 60 to 90 seconds. And hopefully we can bring in another round. Patric.
Okay, to answer this question about how do we take these things forward, I've moved on quite a time ago already from just simply writing about this. Writing was important. We established at the castle the Camisa Museum. We got 4 rooms at the castle. We've developed a museum that challenges this other ways of thinking that we've been brought up with. And why did we choose the castle? Because every week, over every year, in fact, in any one year, over 70,000 school children are taken to the castle. And they're taken there by their teachers, who also have the wrong history in their heads. And they then go and they see this place that tells them nothing about who they are. So we created this Camisa Museum there as a place where children can now go, and adults can go, and read and see, it's quite visual, see what is different about our history, what the true history actually states. And what we have there is a small team of black educationists who then create programs for the children, because you know, it depends on what size the children is, the age, you're going to approach it differently. For small children, we have activities which involve games that ultimately speak to heritage and challenge ideas. So this is happening now every day of the week, and we interact with community-based organizations and NGOs and so on, so that there are different programs happening at different times. This is one way of institutionalizing a challenge to what is the dominant scenario.
Tessa?
So the first thing I wanted to say just about being proud and colored. I spoke to a lot of young people as we did this project, and they call themselves colored, but I have an apprehension because they're judged for it. And so the first thing about taking it forward is let's stop judging each other for claiming identities, especially I don't have any other cultural identity except colored. My father has other cultural identities, my mother does, but this is the cultural identity I have. My nieces and nephews the same. And so I think that's one of the first things within the community we must stop doing, is stop trying this Olympics of who's more right and accept what people have is what they have. The second part of it is calling people to the future. So the history is absolutely important. And I think the kind of work that Patric does, and that a lot of people have done around the colored space, has been about the history. But I do think that we need to start having conversations about the future. And I don't think we've done that enough. We were challenged in writing the book to write the reclamation chapter exactly for that, because we needed to say, okay, not just what's happening now, but what's possible going forward. And so Benjamin Jefter, Zakia Zakias in the music chapter that we write, are all saying that there's actually a moment here for an intentional creation of what it means to be these identities that we love going into the future. And I think that's where the conversation must be.
Nadia?
I think that we fail to see each other as humans first. I think that we're still so hung up on these artificial categories that were placed on us. And in order for slavery to have been successful and apartheid after that, people were stripped of their humanness, of their identity, and I think that it survived in spite of the oppression, and in spite of that, people found ways to connect with each other. And I think that's what we need to focus on. I think that there's a lot more that connects us. And yes, there's cabbage breedy and lang aram and that, but other people, other groups of people in this country also, they might not call it lang aram and cabbage breed or whatever, but there are these connections, and I feel that that's where we need to be going, is to try to connect the common elements and see each other as human beings first of all.
Unfortunately, the gentleman there is waving his arms frantically. Blame him, not us, because he needs to net another conversation. But ladies and gentlemen, give yourself a round of applause, and to our panelists a round of applause. Really appreciate it. They will be signing their books downstairs, and hope you have a good day. Bye-bye.